Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Lost Art Project Veterans Voices. I'm your host, Andrew Cox, and today we're having a part two. You're going to enjoy it. I know I'm going to enjoy it. It's going to be a good time. But before we jump into that episode, are you enjoying the podcast? Then make sure you go to the website. That's the Lost Art Project, veteransvoices.org. Go check it out. See what we're all about. We are a new nonprofit, so if there's any way you can help us, it would be much appreciated. A big shout out to the Till Valhalla Project out there doing amazing things. If you don't know anything about them, go check them out. If you do know something about them, go back and check them out again. Always putting out new stuff, and they're always doing incredible things. You can find them at tillvalhallaproject.com. Are you a Marine veteran? Are you missing that bond you had on active duty? Then I have a place for you. Join the only congressionally chartered Marine Corps Veteran Service Organization, the Marine Corps League. Get that brother and sisterhood back in your life. Become one of the fewer, the prouder, a Marine Corps League member. Oh, I forgot to change it. I'm here by myself right now. We're going to fix that. I'm going to hit the right button here. And boom, here we are. Look who's here. Man, we got Jerry Mullen, Marine veteran, part two of his story. I'm excited. How you doing, Jerry?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited. Now, we talked to your entire career as far as military career on the last episode. And now we're going to jump forward and talk about your law enforcement career. So I'm excited to hear about that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's go ahead and jump into it if you don't mind, and then we'll just go.
Yeah, so I don't remember if I mentioned this on our last episode or not, but the way I kind of initially started thinking about law enforcement was when I was going through the basic school at Quantico in 1987. And I don't know if your viewers are aware of this, but the FBI Academy is located at Quantico on the Marine Corps installation there. And at the time, when I was a second lieutenant going through TBS, my uncle Terry Sheehan, who's since passed away, but he was an FBI agent, and he was at the time happened to be assigned on a TDY assignment to the FBI Academy in Quantico as a field counselor.
Oh, wow.
Essentially, agents from the field will come back on orders and sort of mentor a class of new agents through the academy, and then they supplement the permanent staff that's there at the FBI Academy. Anyways, I got together with my uncle on a Saturday, and he invited me to come over and to give me a tour of the academy, introduce me to some of the staff and the instructors. And I was really impressed. I mean, I thought the facilities were top notch. And compared to kind of what we had at Camp Barrett, I remember thinking, man, the FBI must have a larger budget than the Marine Corps does. So anyways, it kind of planted a seed, and he told me that the FBI hires a lot of military veterans. I mean, the conventional wisdom is that the Bureau only hires attorneys and accountants, and they do certainly hire a lot of attorneys and accountants, but it's by no means the majority. That was something that dates back to the early days of the Bureau. And so that was 1987. I got out of the Marine Corps in 1994, and I didn't really do a very good job planning for my transition. And I had a wife, and our oldest daughter was a year old at the time, so I had a lot of responsibilities. I had a family to look after, and with no job lined up. And my wife and I are both from right outside the Chicago area, so we moved back to Arlington Heights, which is a suburb of Chicago. My wife took a job working in a bank, and then I did find a job relatively quickly, but it wasn't exact. It was just something to kind of pay the bills. It was working for a private security firm in Chicago.
Right.
And, it was weekends and nights, and, the quality of the people certainly didn't measure up to what I was used to in the Marine Corps.
Right.
You're not going to find that with really any job. But it was a difficult transition for me, even though, I was a peacetime veteran. And I, certainly wasn't somebody that had done 20 years in the Marine Corps. It was still a fairly difficult transition. And I didn't necessarily completely grasp that, but my wife certainly could see that. And it came up later on when I had my background investigation done for the FBI.
All right.
I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so the nice thing about working there, though, is that we hired, we had a number of off-duty Cook County Sheriff's deputies that worked for a company where we needed, most of our security were unarmed, but if we had sites that required an armed security officer, we hired off-duty cops. And so I got to meet some of those guys, and they, when they found out my background, they said, hey, you should think about going into law enforcement with your background, and it'll be an upgrade from working here. You'll have better benefits.
Right.
The job itself will be more impactful. And I had friends of mine from high school that were also in law enforcement. One was a Chicago cop, and another was in Forest Park. And so I talked to them, and at the same time, I was also submitting applications for various federal agencies, U.S. Marshals, Secret Service, DEA, and FBI. But I knew that, the process could take a while, and getting hired with a municipal agency or sheriff's office is much more streamlined. And back in those days, it was just looking at the ads, want ads in the paper to see who was hiring. And so I started testing, and I had an offer. Well, what they do is they establish an eligibility list.
Right.
And so you're ranked based on like your test scores, and a lot of agencies will also do like a PT test. And then if you're a veteran, you submit your DD 214 for veterans preference. That's the law in Illinois. Wow. And that bumped me up to, I was in the top 3 for the village of Mundelein, which is where I ended up working, which is a suburb of Chicago and Lake County.
Okay.
And at the time they had about 36 sworn. And it was great because they had openings right away. From the time I had the offer until the time I went through the academy was probably, like a month.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it was myself, and the 2 other new hires were also former Marines. I think I had mentioned this in the last time, but when Nick Polis was a CH-53 crew chief, and he had some law enforcement experience working in a Cook County jail, and then Mike Richards was E5, and he was a COM 3500, I think, COM guy in the Marine Corps. And we got along great. We, the academy was 10 weeks at that time. It was in Springfield, or the Illinois State Police Academy. And it's what they call a stress model. There's non-stress model and stress model. They're really sort of out of favor now. The only agencies that are really still running a stress model typically are like state police,
really?
State patrol. Yeah. It's more of a militarized environment, and because that was the Illinois State Police Academy, that's where they did their cadet training for their troopers. They ran a recruit class, which is what all the local cops went through. The cadet class, I think, was like 23 weeks. And so you're staying in squad bays. You have to wear your uniform every day. It's not like, polo shirts and 511s. There's inspections, and then you march from class to class. And but for me, it was anybody with military background, it's kind of a joke. It's not really, if somebody doesn't have a military background, I suppose it can be a little bit of a culture shock.
Yeah.
But I think the 3 of us, speaking for ourselves, I think we enjoyed the training. It was fairly rudimentary. Becoming a cop is really a 2-part process. So it's not just the academy. Most of the attrition is typically in field training. So when you get to your agency, and you're in your FDO program. And the one that Mundelein had was also a 10-week program. And you have 3 weeks with your primary FTO, then you rotate to a secondary for the second 3 weeks, and then a third for the third 3 weeks, and then you go back to your primary for the 10th week, and they're basically just a shadow. They're wearing civilian clothes, and you're basically handling all the calls, and they're just there in case. No, they're still evaluating you, but in case something goes sideways, and because of your lack of experience. And so that I was only there. I went through the academy from like the first week in March until right before Memorial Day in '95, and then I had my field training, and I think I was cut loose probably sometime in July of '95, and then by July of '96, I put my notice in because I'd gotten an offer letter from the FBI, and I started the FBI Academy on August 4th of '96.
Oh, wow.
The FBI Academy is more of a collegial environment. It's definitely not like the DEA was housed there when I was there. Now they're also at Quantico, but they have their own facility now, and they were much more militaristic the way they
really
ran their academy. Yeah, yes sir, no sir, and they'd have to like stand at attention when the instructors came in their classrooms and stuff. It was I don't know if they still do it that way. I think the DEA probably had a higher percentage of military veterans and former law enforcement, in their ranks. But yeah, the FBI Academy was, there were some really good instructors there. I mean, the legal instruction I thought was top notch. The firearms instruction was excellent. I mean, just some really dedicated and very knowledgeable instructors. Plus, there was, it's funny, like in the Marine Corps, I remember having to patch targets up and then putting the same targets up over the FBI Academy. You shoot up a target, maybe there's only 50 rounds, and just take it down, put up a new one.
Oh, wow.
And that goes back to my earlier point about the budget,
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
So, and there's very little attrition. There probably should have been a little bit more attrition. There were some people that, in my opinion, shouldn't have graduated, but the FBI, at least back then, they invest a fair amount of resources and everything when they do the background and everything to hire someone. So they're maybe somewhat reluctant to cut people loose. In some cases, they can recycle someone if they are struggling. They can roll them back to another class. Whereas, like you hear of DEA students that would, like, if they didn't qualify in their first attempt, for their, whether it's their handgun or the long gun qualification. I mean, they're literally shooting for their job, so there's a fair amount of stress, and if it's like, hey, if you don't make this qualification, you're gone, you're out of here. So, and that there's some benefit to that though. I mean, because you're going to face stress in the job, to be able to try to simulate that a little bit in a training environment for that stress inoculation. That's where like simulations and paintball training becomes somewhat valuable. If you overpenetrate a room or you make a mistake, you might end up feeling that. So, and then the interesting thing about the FBI process is that you don't know where you're going to ultimately be assigned. I mean, you sign a relocation agreement as a condition of employment, and then your first week there, you fill out a preference sheet, essentially like these are the offices I'd like to be assigned to. And back then there were 56 field offices.
Oh, wow.
And you rank them 1 through 56.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And most, most people will try to, if they have a particular region, like for me, it was the Midwest. I just listed, offices within the Midwest, and in Milwaukee was my second choice. I had Chicago as my first choice. I'm kind of glad I didn't get that, just simply because that's where I was from. That's where I processed from.
Right.
And my wife's from that area as well. And then Milwaukee was my second choice. And, the Bureau a lot of times doesn't like to send people back to the office where they process from, unless they're coming out of New York maybe, or LA, where those are hard to staff offices and they're so big. So I was very fortunate because when I was coming out of the academy, there was the special agent in charge of the Milwaukee division had got on with myself and a guy that was in a class ahead of me that he also had orders to the Milwaukee division, got on the phone with the SAC, and he essentially left it up to our discretion. He says, I have a vacancy in Headquarters City in Milwaukee on the drug squad. Back then, this was before 9/11, when we still had drug squads. And then I have a vacancy up in the Green Bay Resident Agency, which was a 4-man RA. And he said, I'll leave it up to you to make the determination. And this other guy, he was also a former Marine. He'd been a Marine Corps officer. I think he was an infantry officer. I'm not certain on that. But anyways, he said he'd prefer to go to Milwaukee because he had, I think he'd gone to Marquette University, so he's familiar with the area. And so that made the decision pretty easy because I didn't really have a preference one way or another.
Right.
Now I look back on that and I think, man, that turned out to be a real blessing because, the morale in the Milwaukee office the whole time I was there was never really that great. And being in a small office, you're away from the flagpole. We had a lot of discretion. There was only 4 of us. And, we got to kind of be a jack of all trades. Right. You're not on a squad where you're just maybe working 1 or 2 violations. You're expected to essentially do everything. And plus we had an Indian reservation. So that's a very unique, that's almost like being a detective, because the crimes that you handle on the Indian reservation are typically not federal crimes, or they wouldn't be, but for the fact that these occur on a federal
just because it's federal
land.
Land, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, and it also gives you an opportunity to go to schools you probably otherwise wouldn't get to attend. Like the state of Wisconsin had a 2-week death investigation school, very good school. And I was able to attend that because you're handling homicides. Unfortunately, the bulk of the cases are sexual assaults. But you also have arsons, even drunk driving if it results in a fatality. You do some drug cases that normally, smaller, lower level drug cases that typically wouldn't be federal because they don't meet the threshold, but because we're on the reservation. I even had an armed robbery case that went to trial.
Wow.
And so, and you also,
and that was all because it was on the reservation.
Correct. Yeah.
Wow.
There's a statute under Title 18 called the Major Crimes Act and I think there's 10 or 11 crimes in the Major Crimes Act that applies to Indian country. And so that's where, as the federal government gets the jurisdiction. In some cases, the BIA may be involved in the reservation. The res we had in Wisconsin was the Menominee Indian Reservation. And they had their own police department, they had their own court system, but the court was only for misdemeanors. And felony cases were handled typically either federally or, if it was at the casino, for example, and it involved a non-Indian, maybe like a marijuana possession or something, there was an agreement with the neighboring county to prosecute non-Indians for those types of violations. There's a fair amount of nuance, and sometimes it becomes there's some question about who has jurisdiction here when you have a domestic and the offender is non-native, but they're on the reservation and the victim is a member of the tribe. The U.S. Attorney's Office would typically have jurisdiction on that, but if the injuries to the victim weren't severe enough to be a felony, in other words, it maybe be a misdemeanor, even though they still have the authority to prosecute a misdemeanor, they typically will just decline. And those offenders sometimes would fall through the cracks because the neighboring district attorney, was basically unable to prosecute victim crimes. He can only prosecute victimless crimes. So, anyways, it's a good experience and certainly the reservation that the Menominee Reservation was not as busy or big as some of the reservations like in North Dakota.
Right.
South Dakota, Montana, where you have entire FBI offices. That's essentially all they do. They might have 4 agents working on one reservation, where for us,
wow,
we had 4 of us in the Green Bay RA, and typically one of the four was full-time on the res, and the other three handled the other 18 counties in the jurisdiction.
Wow.
But I mean, the experience, what I enjoyed the most about it was the ability to interact with local law enforcement, go to their investigator meetings, even like go to their golf outings, and they have different, different associations like the Wisconsin Association of Homicide Investigators, the Association of SWAT Personnel, they run conferences, and then to be a resource. And my supervisor was a big supporter of that. And, we'd go to these meetings and say, hey, if you need a resource that you may not have, you don't have on hand, or even the state may not have, pick up the phone and call me or send me an email. I don't know for sure if we'll be able to provide that, but we can at least look into it. And like I said, I think I mentioned in the last episode where we brought out the USERT, the Underwater Search Evidence Response Team from the New York office, to look for a homicide victim in the Menominee River. So,
wow.
And then I used to, I try to get to as many, retirements as I could if I found out about them, and especially if it was a detective that we had worked with on a case. Like we used to do a fair amount of bank robberies back then. I don't think it's much of a priority anymore. It's still a federal crime, but and I would request the plaque. It's actually like a certificate, but it comes in a nice leather bound case.
Nice.
That the FBI headquarters would send out. And I don't know how many, a lot of agents I don't even think knew that resource was there. My supervisor had told me about it early on in my career, and I would tell guys about it. I'd say, hey, this is a easy thing to do. You just have to type up a little bit of a justification, kind of like writing an award for a Navy Achievement Medal or something, and then fill in the blanks, like the name of the officer, what agency they're working with, maybe how many years they've been on the job. And that would come in via FedEx, usually within a week. And he showed up at the party, and I usually got pretty good reactions, and where these guys would be genuinely surprised. That, hey, somebody went to the trouble to do this, and
that goes a long ways, when you're working with different agencies and stuff like that, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yeah, it does, and I think that's. Unfortunately, that is probably not, it's kind of a lost art, I think. I mean, it's not something that, even when I was going through the academy in 96, it was necessarily really emphasized all that much.
Right.
But it helps when even though I wasn't in local law enforcement for very long, at least I had that perspective and I had that background. And, you kind of understand, like, hey, FBI agents aren't first responders. Sometimes they like to pretend that they are, but they're not. I mean, you spend most of your time, even we did spend a lot of time on the road because we had such a vast geographic territory, but still, I mean, the time in the office is probably at least half your time, if not more, what they call admin burden, doing paperwork. And
so we're talking, it's not like the TV shows where they're constantly out doing something, kicking down doors, doing all that craziness. Most of it is in the office.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know, these obviously if they showed that on a TV show, nobody would watch it. It would be kind of boring. But even police work is like that too, though.
Yeah.
It's a little more dynamic, but you watch like the old Cops TV show, they may take 20 hours of footage just to put together like a half-hour program to get the most interesting calls or whatever to put on the show. So and the other nice thing that being in Green Bay was that even though we were probably like 110 miles from Milwaukee. So it wasn't like we were a couple states away, like in some FBI offices, like in Montana and stuff. So it allowed not just myself, but one of my colleagues, for example, in the Green Bay office was on the evidence response team. I spent just under 10 years on the SWAT team. And normally, if you're in a very remote RA, you don't really have that option because those ERT, maybe it's a little more flexible. But with the SWAT team, there was 2 training days a month. So, it involved, especially when you're not right there in headquarters city, it involves, getting up early and traveling down to Milwaukee, or sometimes we train at Fort McCoy or go down to Madison. But it was nice to be able to have that balance, if you will. I mean, because when you're doing your casework, a lot of times you're not really interacting much with your colleagues. You're working with maybe detectives or like tribal cops, partnering with them, but you're not necessarily working with other agents.
Okay.
You have your own cases, and if you need help on something, certainly, or if you're doing a search warrant, then many times you're requesting assistance from other agents. But to be involved in other collateral duties is nice because it gives you a little bit of a break from your casework, even though the casework obviously is the number one priority.
Right.
And you have to be able to balance that. And I was able to do that. I did new agent interviews for probably 11 or 12 years maybe. And that was a pretty good gig too, because
now what are you saying what exactly is that? Sorry.
So that's when you have people applying to be agents, applicant interviews, they kind of like I don't know if it's the last step in the process. I guess technically the background is, but it's a lengthy process, and a lot of it has to do with the background has to do with the obtaining a top secret security clearance. It's a suitability for employment, but it's also suitability for top secret security clearance. But there was what they call a phase 1 and a phase 2. And the phase 1 is essentially you do like a meet and greet with the applicant coordinator in the office or the recruiter, and they don't have as much discretion as they used to. I think a lot of it is kind of micromanaged out of headquarters now. But if the application sort of meets the minimum qualifications, they're classified whether they're minimally not competitive. Those obviously get discarded. Minimally competitive means technically they meet the requirements, but they're probably not going to be competitive to go on in the process. And then I think there's 2 categories above competitive and then extremely competitive. And the phase 1 is essentially just a kind of a written exam. It's a combination, I think, of like a personality assessment, like an MMPI.
Okay.
And then there's also an academic portion, like reading comprehension. They used to have math on there. I think they took that off for some reason, like time, rate, distance problems and stuff. And then if you pass that phase, then there's another application that has to be completed, and it's SF91 or something. I can't remember the terminology, but it was at the time, I think it was like 16 pages. It's fairly lengthy. I mean, and that's the document that's relied on to do the background. You're putting all your like family members, your references, everywhere you've lived, everywhere you've worked, and you have to do a little bit of investigation on your own as the applicant to provide some of the information that's being asked for. And if you don't provide that, they may just shit can your application.
Right.
And after that is reviewed, and if the person is still considered competitive, then they move on to phase 2, and that was an additional collateral duty that I did. It was kind of enjoyable as it's called a phase 2 assessor. And that phase 2 comprises a 1-hour panel interview with 3 agents on a panel. And then there's a writing exercise. And as assessors, we were also charged with grading the writing exercises, and the applicants are given a hypothetical scenario.
Yeah.
And they would change them up every 2 years. They had like a public corruption scenario. They had the terrorism scenario was the one they were using when I left the program to reflect some of the changes from 9/11. And the applicants are given essentially some basic facts, like some source documents, might be like a DMV, a statement from a witness, and then their job is to take all this information, reduce it into like a summary format. And they're told like you're going to be presenting this to your supervisor with perhaps a recommendation, whether or not this merits further investigation, or, perhaps it needs to be referred to another agency or something. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but the whole point of it is, can this person write coherently? Can they do transition from one paragraph to another? Can they do a good introductory and a good summary? And certainly as assessors, we're not English professors, but we're given a scale in terms of like 1 to 7. And I think there were 3, like their basic grammar and whether or not they actually submitted a recommendation or conclusion. Sometimes these people, they run out of time because they're under a time constraint of an hour and a half, and they have to handwrite it. Now that's maybe changed.
Wow.
And then there's like 24 checklist items where they're just yes or no. Did they mention this? Like the date or the name of the person, some basic stuff. But if they gloss over that and they, hey, they didn't mention that, they get a no. And then so we're not really told what the cutting score is, but if they don't get a certain number of yeses on there, then they fail on the writing exercise. You fail the writing exercise. You fail the phase 2, even though it's technically wasn't weighted as much as the interview. So anyways, I did that for like 12 years, and it was a nice break because the Bureau would fly us out. It was a week. We fly in on a Sunday, and I went to Philadelphia, I went to San Diego, went to Cleveland, and they put you up in really nice hotels because that's where we do the interviews. We don't do them in the office for the most part. And it's like half day on Monday, half day on Wednesday, half day on Friday. I think you do a total of like 14 interviews during the course of the week, and you get to meet agents from all over the country.
Wow.
You have to wear a suit every day and stuff, but that's okay. And so I was able to do that. I was a field training agent, which is kind of like an FTO in police work. It's not as intense. You're not doing an evaluation every day, but we had a new agent come in from the academy right before I retired, and female, very squared away. She'd been a Secret Service uniformed officer.
Oh, wow.
Her father was a cop. So it made it pretty easy. But, as a field training agent, you're sort of the mentor, and you do have to do like a report, I think once a month on the progress of the person. And so, yeah, it's nice to be able to have the option to have those various collateral duties. And I mean, there's a lot of, there's some guys like I said, I mentioned the dive team. Now, we didn't have one in Milwaukee, but some of the bigger offices, they call it USERT, Underwater Search Evidence Response Team. There's a pilot program. Now, not every office necessarily. We used to have a Cessna in Milwaukee just for surveillance, but we ended up losing that. We're close enough to Chicago where they have a whole offsite. If we needed surveillance, if we needed those resources, we would just contact the Chicago office. Some guys like to do, polygraph examinations, and that's a fairly long process, to going through that school and the training. I think it takes about a year to get certified as a polygraph examiner. Yeah. I mentioned ERT, the Evidence Response Team, and then there's all kinds of like cyber specialties now that sometimes your agents, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's probably much higher than it was when I was in where there's that don't have any cases assigned to them. It's become so specialized, or maybe there's some sort of coordinator, like the informant coordinator or the training coordinator. And I never understood. I guess I could see why, or the applicant coordinator, which is why, as you're winding down your career, maybe the last couple of years, I think I'd like to be the applicant coordinator, the informant coordinator.
Yeah.
But, you'd see people that, had only been on the job for a few years, and then they're angling for these coordinator jobs. And it's like, that's not, most of us, at least speaking for myself, I didn't sign up for that.
Yeah.
I wanted to be on the street. I wanted to be an agent. I wanted to be doing investigations. And, the good thing is when you're like I said, you're in a small office, like a 4-man office, like you're not going to be a coordinator or anything. I mean, you have to be in headquarters city, to do those types of jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, there used to be a saying that the FBI was an organization where 99% of the people were fighting to stay on the bottom, which certainly applied to me. I had no desire to go into management. In fact, I wasn't even a relief supervisor. I mean, some guys would be what they call a relief supervisor. So they kind of sit on the desk when the main supervisor is on leave. They don't get paid as a GS-14 or anything, but that can be like the first step if somebody wants to go on the management track. But the problem, in my opinion, is you have to typically, if you want to climb the ladder, and they call blue flamers, typically it's going to require multiple moves. Back to FBI headquarters on the inspection staff, maybe then back out to the field, and then back to headquarters as a unit chief or section chief, and then maybe back to the field as an ASAC, assistant special agent in charge, or special agent in charge. And, it's not like the military where you really don't have a choice. When you get orders, I mean, you got PCS orders, you don't have a choice. And that's not how it is in the FBI. I mean, and I was, in some cases as an agent, whether you're supervisor or not, you may get orders to a top 15 office. Then you don't really have a choice. Now that program didn't come until after 9/11, so I was grandfathered in. That's why I was able to spend my entire career in one office, which was pretty rare. And I think it probably still is. I don't know if the top 15 policy is still in place, but I had no desire to go to a large city, and I had no desire to go into management. Granted, it's a little bit more money, but you're kind of putting your job in front of your family, I think, when you do that. Not, there are exceptions, of course, but to me, that's one of the reasons why, in my opinion, the quality of the management in the FBI is subpar. It doesn't attract the most qualified people. In fact, in many cases, it's just the opposite. It's people that maybe were not particularly good at investigations, and the requirements became so loose after, certainly when Mueller was the director, where you had people that only had 3 years in the field that were putting in for supervisory jobs. That was unheard of in the old days. You had to have at least 10 years as a street agent before you could even think about putting in to be a supervisor. I was lucky. I had.
That's what I would think. I mean, you want the experience, so if you're in that leadership position, you'll be able to recognize the different things that are happening.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's career over country. And like I said, there's exception. I had my last supervisor was a very good supervisor, and he came in. And to his credit, he had primarily a white collar crime background, and we were doing a lot of reactive and violent crime in the RA. And he admitted, like, hey, this isn't my area of expertise, but he didn't pretend to know either. He said, I'm here to learn from you guys. You let me know what resources you need, and that's really what the frontline supervisors should be doing, is ensuring that the field agents, when they need particular resources, that in fact, I had the same supervisor for like 10 years, which is really rare, very unheard of. Very old school guy, stand-up guy. And I'll give you an example. And he was one that didn't have any desire to climb the ladder. He was a GS-14 squad supervisor. That's where he wanted to be. And he would come out on warrants with us. He didn't hide in his office or anything. And he was very proactive in that regard, leading from the front. And I just remember one time we got an email from our SAC when the gas prices went up. At the time, I think it was over $4, kind of like what they are today. And the SAC basically was putting a restriction saying, hey, you can't, if you're in one of the resident agencies, you can't exceed, I think it was like $180 in gasoline charges for the month. And my supervisor, yeah, exactly. He like right away sends us an email, and he didn't just have Green Bay. He was responsible for the Eau Claire RA, which was a 3-man RA, which was also a massive geographical territory in Northwest Wisconsin. He had the Wausau RA, which was a 2-man RA. La Crosse was a 2-man RA. And back then we had an RA in Kenosha as well. So, there were small RAs, but the bulk of the geography of Wisconsin was under Ray's, my supervisor's authority with the small resident agencies. And he sends us an email, probably within like 15 minutes of this email coming out from the special agent in charge. And he said, hey, you do your job. If you need to go over $180 to do your job, then you do it. I will deal with the SAC. I will, take the incoming flack for you so you can do your job. And that's refreshing. I mean,
Oh yeah.
Most supervisors would not be willing to do this, especially if they want to advance, because they're like, I can't get sideways with the SAC. And he understood the priority was that we'd be able to do our job in the case. It's not about advancing careers and everything. And it was so refreshing to have a supervisor like that. And the local cops knew that too. I mean, this guy would have a huge party every year, and he'd invite like the drug unit guys over. In fact, the first year that he did it, it was funny because he got a quarter barrel. And I said, Ray, I don't know if a quarter barrel is going to be enough beer. He goes, you know how much beer? That's like 8 cases of beer. That's going to be plenty. Well, that thing was floating by like 9 o'clock.
Oh, geez.
We had to go out and get a resupply. So it was a good lesson. But, you know, it was a great, and plus I got to do, I got to go to the Winter Olympics in 2002 in Salt Lake City. Our SWAT team went out there, you know, because we were a cold weather team, and we were basically, you know, it was kind of a boondoggle. We were at the Ogden Police Department, essentially on call, and our venue was the ice sheet where the curling event was. And HRT was out there. So we were told, like, hey, if there's some sort, and this wasn't that long after 9/11. I mean, this was in February of 2002. And they had already planned most of this in advance. So I don't know if they may beef things up a little bit because of what happened on 9/11. But we were told, hey, if there's a terrorist incident, you know, you guys are just going to establish probably some sort of security perimeter, and we're going to wait for the hostage rescue team, and then they'll end up handling it.
Wow.
I went to Iraq in 2008 as a representative of the FBI, and you know, for a 90-day deployment. It wasn't like I was going outside the wire or anything. I mean, occasionally we'd leave. I was at BIAP, Baghdad International Airport, and they would travel back and forth to the green zone, you know, occasionally on the Rhinos, or sometimes we take helos to where the embassy was. And that was, in fact, that's where I got a lot of these coins, was in my Iraq deployment, trading FBI coins and stuff. And that was a cool experience. In fact, one of my colleagues that I was there with, our primary role was to interview detainees, Camp Cropper. And the problem is, you know, most of those, like Chemical Ali was there, and he'd been there probably since 2003. So you're not getting a lot of valuable intel from these guys that have been detained for years. It's not like the guys that were scooped right off the battlefield. That's where, you know, obviously more actionable intel comes from. We interview those guys right away. So a lot of what we did was logistical stuff. Like we'd have people from other units maybe coming in, and they needed to interview someone at Camp Cropper, and then we would just fill out the paperwork and sort of facilitate that. And then we might pick them up and give them ground transportation if they're coming in by helo. But one of my partner, he'd only had like 3 years on the job. He was full of piss and vinegar, and he ended up working with the Brits, and they had a source, AQI guy, Al Qaeda Iraq individual, and the Brits were kind of telling their boss, their supervisor, like, because they had rules just like the FBI had rules, and I don't know if they were trying to avoid some paperwork or not, but they said, hey, boss, we're just helping the FBI. You know, this is their source. Meanwhile, our supervisor, he was a nice guy, but he was very risk averse. He was telling my colleague, Gene, like, hey, you can't operate a source overseas. You know, that's an agency thing. Well, Gene told him, like, hey, Greg, don't worry about it. You know, I'm just helping the Brits. It's their source, you know. And the guy, I think, came up with some pretty good information. You know, I went on a couple debriefs, you know, and obviously we have an interpreter there. And at one point he said, I have to show my handlers that I'm doing operations. So Gene was like, well, how do you do that? Well, one way to do it is to show videos of attacks on like coalition troops.
Right. So
Gene, to his credit, like I said, I mean, he wasn't even a GS-13 at the time. I don't think he was a guy that was an attorney in New York, and he joined the bureau because of 9/11.
Oh wow!
He wasn't far from the World Trade Center when a lot of people did that. And anyways, he reserved a training area there at Camp Slayer, and he recruited a couple of soldiers, and parked their Humvee, and we got the Brits out there. And essentially, the plan was we're going to simulate an attack. Like these two guys are like on a break and smoking a couple cigarettes, and they come under attack, and we're going to have gunfire, and then we're going to have one guy go down like he's been shot, and then more gunfire, and then the second guy goes down. Like the first soldier tries to drag his buddy to cover, and then he gets shot. And it was going to be narrated by one of our Terps, and Allah Akbar and whatever he was saying. And then there was a debate about whether to use blanks or actual live rounds. And the decision was, well, we can't use blanks because the report sounds different. And somebody might pick up on that, like, this doesn't sound right. So, it was just a matter of cranking the rounds into the dirt, basically.
Oh, right. Okay.
For the sound, because the video wasn't focused on the shooter. It was focused.
Right. Oh, I see.
The target. Yeah. It was, the whole video was like maybe a minute long. And anyways, I said to Gene, like, hey, what did you, because you have, when you reserve a training area like that, you have to provide, and the big army was running all this stuff. They had like the mayor of Camp Slayer or Camp Victory. And he said, well, I told him we're going to be doing convoy training. And obviously, because live fire wasn't allowed, like, if we get caught, we can always ask for forgiveness. And then our supervisor wasn't there. And I said, hey, where's Greg? And he said, I don't know. He said he had a meeting or something, because he told him about it. And I said, you know why he's not here? And he said, yeah, he knows we're doing some cowboy shit that we're not supposed to. And he'd rather have plausible deniability in case we get caught. Like, I had no idea that's what these guys were doing. But at any rate, apparently that video, the source turned that video over to whoever his handlers were, and it kind of raised his credibility with his terror cell, I guess, because they thought, hey, they thought it was legit. They didn't suspect. Yeah. Wow. So, and that, like I said, that was kind of thinking outside the box. That wasn't really part of our charter. But and by the way, that individual ended up, he may still be there. He became the SAC, the Omaha division.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I know I was just kind of bashing on FBI leadership, but there are some good ones. I suspect he's probably one of the good ones, because it's funny because he was, myself and one of our electronic technicians were in a chow hall one day, and we were kind of griping about something, and he's like, man, you guys are really cynical. And it was like, well, you've only been on the job for 3 years. Wait till you've been around a little bit longer. And not that I was particularly salty, but at that point I had 12 years, and I think Randy had probably hit close to 20. Yeah. And it was funny because by the end of we were getting close to the end of our 90 days, and Gene would be banging the table. He'd be reading his email and be getting so frustrated because he's being micromanaged, and they were telling him he had to polygraph this source I was telling you about, which was stupid because the guy had already proven himself. He didn't, and you're more than likely to piss him off. Like, you don't believe me, and now you're making me take this polygraph. Yeah. And I said to him, now look who's cynical. So that didn't take long. You've only been here for 3 months, and now you're getting cynical. So,
oh, that's funny.
Yeah. So anyways, that, and then I got to, right before I retired, I went back to Quantico as a counselor for the FBI National Academy, which was a great experience. I mean, so at the Academy in Quantico, they have the new agents training, and then they have the FBI National Academy, which is a 10-week program. It's been around since 1935. It was it was a brilliant concept that Hoover came up with too, because there was some support at the time in Congress, and I think maybe even in the public, to have a national police force. Because in the early days of law enforcement, there was a fair amount of corruption. There wasn't a whole lot of training. It was, the hiring decisions were based on who you were related to or who you knew, and there was, it wasn't uncommon for suspects to take a beating, that type of thing. So there was this support or this movement, like, hey, by that time, by 1935, the FBI had been around technically since 1908, but, really is a viable in fact, they weren't officially authorized to carry firearms until 1934, but the Bureau had been around long enough, I think, to establish a reputation with the American public.
Uh-huh.
And Hoover, to his credit, I mean, he knew that was a bad idea. He said that's not really consistent with a free country. I mean, that's something they have in tyrannical countries. And what he suggested was we should professionalize law enforcement, law enforcement. And part of that was the FBI National Academy, and it's still thriving to this day. In fact, when John F. Kennedy was president, they opened it up to international students, and I don't know, they're up to like almost close to session 300. I think I was there for session 268, and you have to be, I think, at least a lieutenant or above to attend. And there's a waiting list. I mean, the percentage of law enforcement officers that graduate or from the National Academy is probably, less than 5%. But it's the networking is really where the true value comes into it, because then you become part of this network, the National Academy Associates. But the training's pretty, and there's a heavy emphasis there on physical training.
Oh, really?
And the PT instructors are outstanding. And the idea, I think, is to not just for the benefit of the officers that are attending, but because they're in leadership positions, to take that back to their agencies and try to incorporate a culture of not just fitness, but overall officer wellness. In fact, the kind of the capstone event is the Yellow Brick Road, and it's the Marine Corps endurance course. And the guys that graduate from the National Academy, they get a yellow brick. It says FBINA, and then it has their session number. And you'll see a lot of them will have it on display in their offices and stuff.
No kidding.
Yeah, and it was funny because I ran that as a counselor in 2017 at the age of 52, and I remember running it in 1987.
Yeah.
As a Marine Tech, except when I ran it in 1987. It was a timed event, and you had all your gear, your
you had everything,
your buck, your rifle, everything. It wasn't really as enjoyable as it was going through the NA student, because you're just basically wearing. I can't remember if we wore shorts or like utility pants, but just t-shirts and stuff.
Yeah.
And, because going over the obstacles and stuff. So then. That was for 10 weeks. And then, I really didn't want to, and I was there as a counselor, so I didn't have to do the classes, other than we do all the PT stuff. But most of what we do as counselors there is logistical support. There's a big auction near the end of the NA class where I think we raised over $30,000 for charity for cops. It's for children of and family members who've lost a loved one to a line of duty death.
Right.
And these guys will bring in all kinds of swag, like a guitar signed by Luke Bryan, or a lot of athletic, like a Alabama helmet signed by Nick Saban, and that stuff will go on for auction. In fact, we had a guy in my class he's from Denver, and he bought this uniform. We had a cop there from Germany, and he I don't know if he got in trouble or not, but he put his uniform up for auction, and this guy from Denver ended up putting an high bid on it. And we went back to the boardroom that night, and he's wearing this, and it fit him like a glove. It was almost like, it was custom fit for him. It kind of looked like a airline pilot uniform, but it was a cop uniform. And so he says to me, "Hey, Jerry, what kind of trouble will I get in if I wear this to class tomorrow?"
Oh, geez.
I said, "What are they going to do to you, Joel? Send you back to Denver?" I mean, somebody might tell you to go get changed, but at that point there was only like a week left. So
yeah,
but it was a great experience. And then that our class finished up in June, and then by September I was retired from the Bureau, and it was they say you kind of know when it's time to pull the plug, and when you're younger and you don't necessarily grasp that concept, but once I got to that point, I think I started to realize, I think this is true. And I mean, I could have 57 is mandatory retirement age. I could have gone up for 5 more years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but things had changed, and my heart probably wasn't in it as much as it used to be. And one of the things that changed is that, and this had been going on for a while. I mean, it was really since 9/11, but the Bureau had established what's called a guardian system for members of the public to submit leads and tips, and it's it's a well-intentioned system, but unfortunately, you end up going down a lot of rabbit holes, and we call it chasing ghosts. So and it tends to sometimes take priority over all your other work. So you get a tip like, hey, this individual was taking photos of like the Great Nitschke Bridge in Green Bay, and it appeared like it could be like pre-surveillance activity. And the person that's reporting it maybe copied down the license plate of the driver, and they said this person to be Middle Eastern male. Well, then they run the plate, and if it comes back to a driver within your territory, then somebody in the office is typically going to get assigned that guardian lead for follow-up. And a lot of times what you find is like the person was Hispanic, and doesn't mean, I guess they might have nefarious intent, but typically, that wasn't the case. They were just interested in taking pictures. And so, when you go to someone's house with one of those leads, you need to be, and I was always trying to be very diplomatic, because I didn't want to come off like a jackbooted thug or anything. And I'd say, hey, this is why I'm here. In fact, we had one of the leads I had, we had a guy that flew over Lambeau Field during a Packer game, because we were involved in the security detail for the Packers. And, he was clearly flat hatting. He was violating, the airspace, the FAA airspace.
Right.
And that guy was a surgeon, very wealthy guy. It was his own plane. He lived in like a mansion on the west side of Green Bay. And I got that lead to go talk to him, because the NFL was not happy with this guy, And he didn't fly like right over the stadium, but he kind of flew a beam, and he was probably under 1,000 feet. And I go to his house, and he was very apologetic, and he said, hey, am I going to be on a watch list now? And I said, no, I mean, my job is to make sure you're not a terrorist. I'm pretty sure you're not a terrorist. You might have an issue with the FAA, flight violation, but that's not our thing. And so, but we'd get those types of leads. And, he said, I've been approved for extended downwind before by tower. And I said, yeah, but it wasn't during a game. Because the rules change, when you have a crowd over, I think like over 1,000 people or something. And certainly, Lambeau Field's capacity is probably like 80,000 or something.
Oh, yeah.
So, and then the other thing I forgot to mention, AJ, was we also hosted the city of Green Bay hosted the Medal of Honor convention in 2007.
Right. And
we kind of got a seat at the table for the planning of that, for security. And there were a lot of agencies involved, because, that's a week-long event, and they have different activities going on each day. I mean, it culminated with the Packers and Eagles, their home opener.
Okay.
Where we brought all these guys down on the field before the game, and then they were kind of scattered throughout the stadium in different. They got to sit, luxury boxes of fans and stuff, so make it a great experience for them. But I mean, that I got to meet quite a few Medal of Honor recipients, like I mentioned on our last discussion. Colonel Fox. I met Richard Pittman. In fact, I got one of his coins. He's got a custom coin. Robert O'Malley, another Marine Medal of Honor recipient from Texas. I have his coin. Tom Norris, who was an FBI agent. He was a Navy SEAL. Got to meet him, and it was just an incredible event. And in fact, maybe we can talk a little bit about the Stolen Valor stuff, because we did have an incident there, a Stolen Valor incident. unbelievably at this event where this guy showed up. It was a breakfast on the farm, and there was a Desert Storm group that was, I think they did the colors. And I wasn't at this particular event, but it was referred to me later to kind of do some follow up on. And this guy showed up, and in the desert camis, the pre-digital ones, and he had like jump wings with a star, I believe, which is symbolizing like a combat jump, which are, back then that was pretty, well, even today, I mean, that's obviously pretty rare. And I believe he had a Ranger tab as well. And Al Rascone, who was one of the Medal of Honor recipients, was at this event, Vietnam vet, and his bullshit meter went up with this guy, and so he went over and he started engaging him in conversation. And he's like, "Hey, where'd you do your combat jump?" And the guy said, into Kuwait. he's like, "God, the United States didn't do a combat jump into Kuwait." And I don't know how this guy reacted, but I think Mr. Rascone or somebody there summoned one of the deputies over, and they confiscated this. They took this jacket off of this guy, and they kicked him out.
Wow.
And so back in the hospitality suite, they had the jacket on display, and then Mr. Rascone had signed his name on the pocket, and he put phony on there, and the date and everything. And that, I ended up, once the event was over, I ended up in possession of that. And I ended up donating that to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. But Colonel Howard, who passed away a few years ago, he was the incoming president. And I had a meeting with him, and man, that guy is a legend. If you've ever read his citations, and his special forces guy is just incredible. And but he asked me to follow up with this young man, and I said, "Roger that, I'd be happy to." And so I went out to this guy's house, and he was pretty remorseful about the whole thing. And he said he had been in the Army for like a year or two, and then he got he wasn't technically kicked out, but I think he had a medical issue or whatever, but he never deployed or anything. And I said, "Look, if you'd be willing to write an apology to the Medal of Honor Society, taking responsibility for what you did, saying, 'Hey, I'm really sorry, I'm not going to do this again,' whatever, then as far as I'm concerned, I think we'll be good." Because it's unlikely anybody would be willing to prosecute that. And he said, "Yeah, I'd be willing to do that." And so I gave him the address, and sure enough, I got a call like a week later that he followed through, and he wrote this letter and everything. So, and then, like I said, that item was donated to, I don't know if they've ever put it on display, but I did donate it to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And that kind of I had a number of other cases, and in one case that actually went to trial, where the guy was
for stolen valor.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, for stolen valor.
Holy cow!
It was a bench trial, because it was a misdemeanor.
Yeah.
And it was a magistrate judge, but it was just a one-day trial. And this guy was, he was a Vietnam era vet, but he hadn't served in Vietnam. And, he was in an American Legion post in Fond du Lac, and he was, she would show up, and he was part of their color guard, and he had they'd have their miniatures on their lapel, and he was displaying Purple Heart and a Bronze Star with a Valor device. And the guys in his post, like, they knew he that he was full of shit, but they tried to, handle it in-house, if you will. Like, "Hey, Bill, you need to take that off." And and he refused. So I don't know how long this went on for, but at some point they just got fed up with it. And one of the guys, he's a World War II vet, picked up the phone and called our Milwaukee office. And then it got referred to me because Fond du Lac was within our territory in Green Bay.
Yeah.
And it's not Sherlock Holmes stuff. I got his actual DD-214, and I had photos of him displaying these decorations that he didn't rate. And, I went to interview him, and same thing. I told him, like, "Hey, if you agree never to do this again, you issue an apology, you won't hear from me ever again, and that'll be the end of it. And he was like, nope, I'm not doing that. This is bullshit. And I was like, okay, fine. And surprisingly, the U.S. Attorney's Office agreed. And this was like in 2005, so it's still kind of in the early stages of GWAT.
Right.
And he took it to trial. I think the guy maybe had some mental health issues. And that there's a fine line with some of these. You got to be careful. Like sometimes, I'm not excusing it, but maybe that's why his posts try to cut him a little bit of slack. But yeah, we went to trial, and it was funny because the AUSA asked me to. He says, you're going to be. We put a couple of witnesses on in the morning from the Post just to establish his conduct and his behavior and get the pictures entered in as exhibits. And then we were breaking for lunch, and the AUSA says to me, you're going to be my last witness right after lunch, which I was expecting, because I'd interviewed the guy. But he said, because we had his ribbon rack, and he says, I want you to go through each of these decorations and kind of explain the history and the criteria. And I'm like, I wish you would have told me that a little bit earlier, so I spent my entire lunchtime, you kind of have a general idea, right? Like what it takes to be awarded a Purple Heart, for example. But fortunately, the defense attorney didn't have any cross-examination. I mean, he probably didn't know the difference between a Sea Service Deployment Ribbon and a Purple Heart. So, so he ended up getting convicted, and these vets there was a bunch of guys that showed up for the trial, and they were happy he was convicted, but they were a little bit unrealistic in the what their sentencing expectations were. I mean, I think they were hoping this guy was going to go to prison.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. I mean, this is a misdemeanor. And in fact, the sentencing was like a couple months after the trial. And I think he got like 30 hours of community service and a couple $100 in fines. But it made the news. It made the local news in Fond du Lac, which is sometimes is just as good of an outcome because, it exposes the person and then maybe becomes a deterrent for someone else engaging in that behavior. We had another individual who, I think I mentioned this in the last one, but he was applying for local law enforcement jobs and was exaggerating his accomplishments, or at least there was suspicion of that. And he actually provided documents that were altered. And so it was a little bit more serious. And but he actually had honorable service. I mean, he had been a Marine infantry 0311. I think he was an 0311. He was an 03 maybe machine gunner or something. But he'd done a deployment to Iraq, combat action ribbon and everything. It's like, man, why do you feel the need to exaggerate? And he was, at the time, he was with a guard unit in Wausau. And they actually believed his story. They obviously didn't vet him very well, but he was teaching like CQB, and he kind of knew what he was talking about because he learned that in the Marine Corps. So it gave him some credibility. And when he came into our office for an interview, and the detective from Green Bay PD was a command sergeant major, he just went off on him. And of course, the guy nearly shit himself. And that one was resolved through the UCMJ because I think he probably just got kicked out of his unit. I don't know if they actually, tried to court-martial him. They certainly probably would have had grounds to do that.
Yeah.
And then there was another guy who was he went into the recruiting office in Appleton, claimed he was a retired staff sergeant, or maybe, I don't know if he said he was retired or not, but he claimed he'd been a drill instructor. Hey, I'm just here I'd like to help out with the police. Yeah, no problem. And they didn't really bother to vet him. And then one day he showed up in his dress blues, and, his ribbons were not in proper precedence, proper order. And that was a real red flag, especially for someone who claimed to have been a drill instructor. And then the recruiter there figured out pretty quickly that this guy was a phony, and he had never served. I mean, he was a complete fraud. And
wow.
Yeah, that one got referred to me because the staff sergeant there that was a recruiter called a detective from Appleton, and he used to rely on, like, for tattoos. Like if he had a prospect come in and he had some questionable tattoos, he would take a picture of it and send it to this detective and say, hey, is this a gang tattoo? And so he called this detective up and he said, hey, do you guys handle like stolen valor? And because like I said earlier, I knew a lot of these detectives. he said, no, but I know there's an FBI agent in Green Bay that has an interest in that. So that one was referred to me.
Wow.
And I went and interviewed this guy, and he was apologetic and everything. And I said, well, maybe we should go visit the recruiting station, and you don't apologize to me. You need to apologize to those guys. And he says, okay. He goes, well, you come with me. And I said, yeah, if you want. He goes, because I'm afraid of those guys. And the head recruiter in there, who ended up he may still be on active duty. He got promoted all the way up to sergeant major. So he's obviously had a very successful career. At the time, he was a staff sergeant. And, I think he was a Micmac instructor.
Yeah.
He was so he wasn't a real big guy, but he's very, very somewhat intimidating, very stocky, very muscular. And this guy goes in there, and he prepared remarks on a letter that he wrote, and he starts reading it, and Staff Sergeant Vargo was just pacing back and forth. And after 2 or 3 sentences, he's just starting in with the knife hands, and he says, I don't want to hear, he's like screaming at him. Like, I don't want to hear about your tough childhood or anything. And that doesn't give you a license to do what you did. And I mean, he was like right in his face. And I was thinking, holy shit, this could get ugly. And the guy was like, he was about to shit himself, I think. And so I said, hey, I think it's time for us to leave. And I got him out of there. And we ended up, of course, we didn't really have any authority. I confiscated. He had an NCO sword that he had bought online. And I said, hey, I'm going to have to confiscate that. I really had no legal authority to do that. He didn't know.
Yeah.
I said, that's contraband. So he gave it up to me. God only knows how much he probably paid, several $100s for this.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. And I said to the Staff Sergeant Vargo, like, you want this? And he goes, well, maybe we should donate it to either the VFW post or Legion post or something. So yeah, that was and then I put in Staff Sergeant Vargo for an award, an FBI award.
Oh, nice.
And when I told him, hey, I'm going to come out and I'm going to present you this, like I mentioned earlier with the retiree awards, it was very similar to that. And I pull up to the recruiting station and I see a media truck there. And he's not, he's smart. He's a recruiter. He knows, hey, we take advantage of this. This is good publicity for us.
Yeah.
I didn't know he was going to do that. And, I wasn't really authorized to do a media appearance. Technically, FBI agents aren't allowed to do media appearance. I need permission in advance. But, what am I going to do? Like, I can't, say, hey, I'm here to present this award, but I can't be on camera. So I just, we did a little award thing, and then there was a bit of a Q&A afterwards. And, I got home and I told my wife, and she's like, oh, you're going to get in trouble. I said, I don't think anyone's going to know. Because our main office was in Milwaukee. This was on the Green Bay news station, and I never heard about it. So I never heard back from that.
Wow. Well, that's good.
So, yeah, that was fun. And then so those cases, and that's not even all of them. There's others that I was involved with, but suffice it to say that kind of sparked some research on my end to say, hey, we should probably. The state of Wisconsin should probably consider enacting a stolen valor statute.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't one at the time. The case that we had that went to trial was in federal court. It was under Title 18. And it just so happened that around the time I was doing this, we had a new rep in my district that was elected to the state assembly. I think the person before retired. And so I went and met with him, and I explained to him about the whole, like, how I've had these cases, and that even though there's a federal statute, it's hard to get the feds interested in prosecuting it because it's a misdemeanor. And because that was his first question, like, is this redundant if we're doing this? And I said, there's plenty of states. It wouldn't be like you're breaking any new ground here. There's plenty of states that already have. Especially in the South. In fact, I had a statute from Alabama or something that I printed out, and I said, you can use this language or similar language for the Wisconsin statute. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And he kind of liked that idea because he was, he's brand new, and this is something that was nonpartisan. and we found a co-sponsor in the Senate who was an Air Guard guy, and it passed on a voice vote. I think it was unanimous consent. And when Governor Walker was in office at the time, when he signed the bill into law, I got invited to the bill signing. There's a bunch of Legion guys there and stuff, and then you get one of the pens and everything. So it was kind of cool. I don't know if the statute's ever actually been enforced. I tried to I had a case where we were gonna, the DA seemed interested, where a guy got some work done on his van. And he claimed he was a disabled Navy vet, and it turned out he was a entry-level separation. And it was like $500, and the problem is the dealership, even though they were technically the victims, they didn't really want to pursue it. And it's like, man, we'll just write this. I think he may have still been charged with like theft by fraud, but they didn't use the stolen valor statute. So,
wow.
Anyways, I was, like I said, going back to my supervisor though. He gave me the latitude to kind of work on those cases, because he could have said, "No, this is low priority stuff." But he was pretty decent about it. I mean, he wasn't a veteran, but he understood the importance of it. He says, as long as it doesn't interfere with your main casework, knock yourself out. And the most serious case was a guy that actually did get sentenced to prison, and that was.
For stolen valor?
Well, no, but it started off as stolen valor, and then what happened is he was in the airport in Milwaukee, and he was wearing a uniform, wearing lieutenant colonel rank, wearing basically his greens, the equivalent of alphas, except in the Army version,
right?
And he was confronted by a staff sergeant who was in civilian attire, who, I think he didn't have a combat patch, and yet he was wearing like combat ribbons. It's like, where's your combat patch? That's the thing the Army does, obviously. And then he asked, he asked the guy, I think what his initial contact was, he pulled out his CAC card and he said, "Sir, my name's Staff Sergeant Barnes. I'd like to see your CAC card." And the suspect, this guy's name is Brian Austin, pulls out a card and shows it to him, and it was a dependent card. And the staff sergeant goes, "That's a fucking dependent ID card." He's not going to notice that. Yeah. And so this staff sergeant was pissed, and the Milwaukee County Sheriff's Office, has a substation at the airport there in Milwaukee, and he filed a report. And they detained this guy, but they sent him on his way, but they did take a report. So we had all of his identifiers, and he was living in De Pere, and that was because that was in our territory in Green Bay. That one was sent to me. And we went out to his house to do an interview, and, he consented to a search of his computer. And we thought, at least I thought, that I had suspicion there might be child pornography on there. Turns out it wasn't child pornography, but he had been videoing a previous girlfriend without her consent, like coming out of the shower, getting changed and stuff. Well, that's a felony in Wisconsin, as it is in most states.
Yeah.
And we've located that just to make sure she didn't consent to it. And, she went on the record and said, "No, I didn't consent to that." She was horrified by the whole thing. In fact, she gave a victim impact statement at his sentencing. But yeah, he got charged with like 7 counts of capturing nudity without consent.
Wow.
And even though the stolen valor stuff kind of went away, but at that point I said, "Man, this is even better, because these are felonies." And the judge, and that because there was a chance he was going to just get probation. That's what the probation agent told me, because he was doing the pre-sentence investigation.
Right.
And I said, "Man, this guy is a sociopath. He needs to go to prison." But of course, I'm biased. That was my opinion. Kendall Kelly was the judge, and he was a Navy vet. In fact, he presided over the Veterans Treatment Court there. And he really took a dim view of what this guy had done. And he sentenced him, I think, to 2 years in prison or whatever. I don't think he did the whole time, but he definitely was locked up for a while. And then that was like 2011. I just got a call last summer, that he was, he's out basically manipulating women. And I mean, he's like almost like a Ted Bundy type, he's very personable and charismatic, but he's really a kind of an evil guy. And somebody looked up and found this case from back in 2011, and they saw my name and they were able to track me down. And I was like, yeah, this guy's, he's, there's not many, the percentage of people that you meet, even as in law enforcement, that are really truly evil or like true sociopaths is pretty small, single digits. But this guy was one of them, I think, and in my opinion, he was pretty scary. But I mean, there wasn't much I could do for this person, like, other than your instincts are right, and you should probably steer clear of this guy as much as possible.
Wow.
So he clearly wasn't reformed or anything when after going to prison. So
shoot, he might have got worse. I don't know. He might have learned tricks.
Unfortunately, sometimes that's what happens when people get incarcerated. They hone their skills as a criminal. So
I like that, hone their skills. Yeah, that's good. Well, I had some questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I've been talking for a while.
Because you like collateral duties that you had. So you mentioned SWAT. So when I think SWAT, I'm thinking like a city SWAT team, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you guys are coming from different areas or different locations. So if that SWAT team is called, like, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question, AJ. Yeah, it's pretty much everything we did was a planned operation. So it's not like like the Green Bay Police Department had a tactical team, and probably half their call outs, maybe if not more, are reactive. Like they have a barricade, domestic, and the guy barricades himself or something. So they don't have the luxury to necessarily like do a deep dive on the target house or whatever. They have to respond and try to get intel on the fly, or once they get on scene. Whereas when I was on the SWAT team, well, first of all, I started in '99. I mean, the first probably 4 or 5 years, we rarely did any operations. We did our training, and in fact, some guys would say, "This is bullshit." I'm not. They would just turn in their stuff because there was a certain risk aversion, because to do a SWAT operation, it had to be approved by the special agent in charge. And if something went sideways, on a SWAT op, then that SAC is technically on the hook for it. If they could defer it to, like that happened in Milwaukee, where they had a guy who was an America's, he was that TV show America's Most Wanted. He'd been featured on that show with John Walsh, and somebody provided a tip that he was holed up at some place in Milwaukee, and so he was wanted on a federal. The underlying warrant was, it was a bank robbery where he took hostage. So it was a federal crime. It was a Title 18 crime. It wasn't a state crime. And then what happened was they set up a perimeter, and of course MPD was out there as well. And somebody came out of the house, got in the car, drove away. They did a traffic stop, talked to the driver, showed him a picture of this guy, and whoever the driver was, confirmed that he was there. So now they have probable cause that he was actually in the residence. So they went and got a federal search warrant. So you get federal paper for the arrest and for the search. And there was an attempt at negotiations, and that wasn't going well. So eventually a decision was made, hey, we're going to have to do an entry to go and get this guy. And it should have been, now I wasn't there for this, but this was one of the rare cases where the FBI SWAT was called out to kind of an unfolding situation. Normally, like I said, you got an arrest warrant or search warrant for somebody, you're going to do a 6 a.m. hit. You brief it the day before and everything. And but the SAC was like, no, we're going to let MPD do it. So that's embarrassing, And in fact, we had got to leave the team over that, and even some of the MPD guys were like, they didn't mind doing it. I mean, that's their job. They're probably glad, but they're like, man, we can't believe how you guys got kind of thrown under the bus. And it certainly betrays or a lack of confidence, in the capabilities and stuff. Well, that eventually changed, and I think at some point the SACs were, given a stat, so they started to incentivize it. No, you should be using your SWAT team. That's what we spend this money for equipment and ammunition and resources and and stuff. And but the training got a lot better too, because when I I was on the SWAT team from 99 to 2009, and each field office basically did their own tryout. Like the Milwaukee division was small, so we had like, at the time we had 12 guys. We were authorized 12 guys on the SWAT team. And it was a one-day tryout. And like I tried out, they had 3 openings, and there was only 6 guys that showed up. And whereas like Chicago's an enhanced team, they probably have 60 operators on the team. And in some of the bigger field offices, their tryout might be a week or 3 or 4 days. Well, the SWAT operations unit in Quantico, sometime after I left the program, but they implemented a national standard, standardized tryout for all the SWAT teams. So like if you transferred from one field office to another and you were certified as a SWAT operator, the new office is going to know, like, okay, this guy,
like he's legit. He did his stuff.
Yeah, at least we know he's been through the same certification. It's, I think, a 80-hour, 2 weeks basic SWAT course. And then they have an online system now where, like an Excel spreadsheet, where it's a color code, green, yellow, or red. And if you're not current, like if you haven't done a firearms qualification in the last 30 days or there's different frequencies depending on the skill. Like if it's a maritime team, they have to do maritime training maybe once a year, water training. Like obviously the firearms proficiencies is much more frequent because it's a perishable skill. And so that was never in place, when I was in SWAT team, it was much less formalized. So, if there's an op coming up and a guy isn't all green, it maybe depends on the type of op it is, but he might not be able to participate because it becomes if there's a shooting and then there's obviously there's a shooting review after the fact, but then there's potential for litigation and all of that stuff becomes discoverable. All those the failure to train it puts as it should puts liability on the agency even if it may be a justifiable use of force. So that was my experience on the SWAT team. I mean, it was the training is gets to be a little bit of a grind. There's a lot of but it's muscle memory, a lot of repetitiveness, especially the CQB stuff. And as you get older, by the time I left the team, I was like I was in my 40s, and you feel it like just from wearing the body armor all, because typically we'd have one day as a firearms day, and then the second day was a tactics day. And now, I mean, after I left, they increased those. I think it's a minimum of like 4 training days a month now. And the enhanced teams, there's 9 enhanced teams. I think they have like 5 training days a month, if I'm not mistaken. So it starts to become more burdensome in terms of trying to balance that with a big caseload. And that's not saying it can't be done, but it does. It's as one of the collateral duties. It's probably more time because like ERT, evidence response team, has various schools and they train as well, but they don't necessarily need to train like 4 days a month, to maintain their proficiencies in their skills and stuff. So, but I enjoyed the, like I said earlier, the camaraderie, kind of what I may have missed, what I was missing, like from my time in the military. And, we were, like I said, we had a pretty small team, but we, you get some of the best agents, in my opinion, that go out of their way because they're type A's, and they're looking to do more than just the minimum. Not that I'm not criticizing somebody who, doesn't maybe participate in a lot of collateral duties, but, on the other hand, it did take me away from my family more. And those are times, you lose those moments sometimes with your kids. We got 3 girls and everything. And, I told my wife when I was getting out of the Marine Corps that, I'm going to be home now and, no more deployment and stuff like that. Well, she would remind me, that turned out not actually. I mean, I wasn't as gone as often. So certainly in like a fleet Marine unit or Navy unit where you're going on unit deployments and stuff like that. But still, I mean, like the Iraq thing, I volunteered for that. And that was 90 days. And it wasn't like I was forced to do that or anything. But luckily, she was very understanding. By the way, that's had we not been in Green Bay, I don't know if I would have been able to do that, because a lot of times agents' wives have to work, or their spouses, if it's a female, have to work just to make ends meet.
Oh, right.
And the cost of living in Green Bay was pretty reasonable, and we were able to, survive, pay our bills and everything. And my wife was a stay-at-home mom the whole time, which is what she wanted. It's better.
Yeah.
I think it's better for the kids when you can do that. So
yeah, absolutely.
And it gave me that, because she was a stay-at-home mom, for me to be going to the Olympics or be going to Iraq, I mean, I knew that she was taking care of the home front. I didn't.
Right.
With a working spouse, a lot of times agents, they don't have the luxury. They do their job just like any other 9-to-5 job, but then they, they have to share their burden with raising the kids and being home for that. So,
yeah. Very true.
Yeah, the SWAT, the FBI SWAT logo. Somebody drafted a logo. Probably maybe 2016 or right around the time I retired. And and if you get a chance to look it up, it's a pretty cool logo. It's got a partial American flag, partial FBI seal, and it's got this like eagle in a dive. It's got the number 73 on there, because that was the year the SWAT program started. They couldn't start the SWAT program until after Hoover died. And there's been some controversy, I guess, about that, because most teams have their own patch.
Right.
And they I don't want to wear this national patch. But the Milwaukee team, we had the Harley Davidson logo.
Really?
Patch. Yeah. Instead of motorcycle Harley Davidson, it said Milwaukee FBI. So it was pretty cool. But Harley Davidson put the clamps down on that, though, because a lot of even the Marine recruiters in Milwaukee had Marine Machine, USMC Recruiting Station, Milwaukee, and they were using the Harley Davidson logo.
Wow.
Probably without their permission. I think Harley finally put out a statement like, hey, if we find out you're doing this, we're going to sue you. And rightfully so. They own the logo. But it was a cool logo. It was a cool patch. So.
Well, I got to tell you, the Marine Corps is very stringent when it comes to the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor.
Yeah.
If there's somebody out there making money off that or misinterpreting what it is type of thing, they're very quick to say something. The legal team up there's always on the lookout for it.
Yeah, as they should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got to protect the brand. That's
right.
Well, I know we're getting long here. I would, if I could tell one quick story.
Oh, you're good.
My days so my very first DUI arrest when I was on my own.
Okay.
Was, somebody had called in I think it was an off-duty firefighter, and it was back when they had the bag phones. This is 95, and
okay.
Cell phones were still kind of a new thing. And he was behind this vehicle that was heading in the direction of our municipality. And, the individual was crossing the center line and was driving erratically. And, the guy suspected, and rightfully so, that the driver was under the influence.
Right.
So I started basically make your own case, right? I started heading up that direction, and I was and I'm heading the opposite direction. So I'm trying to, as the vehicles are passing me in the other direction, I'm trying to catch the vehicle description, the color, even the license, the front plate. And I see what I believe to be the vehicle. So I start to initiate a 180 to get behind the vehicle and activate my overheads. And it couldn't have been more than probably 30 seconds. And in fact, I think even before I completed the turn, I could hear a crash, crunching metal, fairly loud sort of explosion, if you will. Yeah. And the guy had drifted off the road, and he ran over a fire hydrant, and then he hit like a power pole, and the power line came down, and it was arcing in the road. So this is a pretty severe situation, So I'm on the radio right away, and I said, I call out my location. I said, I'm going to need the fire department out here, and we got a power line down. And then the dispatcher said, are you going to need rescue? I said, yeah, we're probably going to need rescue too, because the driver, I'm sure, was going to be in rough shape. And anyways, I approached the vehicle. My sergeant rolls up. He tells me just to get away, let the fire department handle it for now. And because the guy was kind of curled up in a fetal position on the floor. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt or anything. And anyways, they take them, they extract them from the vehicle, they put them on an ambulance, and they take them to Condell Medical Center, which is the closest hospital. And as he's laying there, prior to going into the ER, he's unconscious. And I'm asked, I have to get a blood draw from him because he can't do an intoxilizer because he's passed out and he's unconscious. So the nurses get ready to draw his blood so I could take it back. And I'm reading the what they call the Illinois warning to motorists, which is standard procedure when somebody's being processed for a DUI. And she looked at me and she said, he can't hear you, right? I said, that's not my problem. It's going to my report that he was issued his Illinois warning to motorists. Whether he could hear or not is irrelevant. His lawyer's not going to say you didn't give him his warning to motorists. And then the first time I made a federal arrest was not as an FBI agent, but as a local police officer. I made a traffic stop on a vehicle that had out-of-state plates. I can't remember. It might have been New York plates. And I can't remember what the probable cause was for the stop. It was probably something minor traffic violation, but something was suspicious about this guy. And the car was packed with clothes and sea bags and stuff. And I made contact with the driver, and he gives me a driver's license, which was also out of state, but a different state. Didn't match the plates on the car, and it wasn't Illinois. And so I said, hey, why do you have like New York plates and Virginia driver's license, whatever? And he said, well, I'm in the Navy. And I was like, okay. And he looked like it kind of long hair. He didn't really look, although, he's a Navy guy, so you never know. Yeah. And I said, well, what brings you here? What brings you to Illinois? And he said, well, I'm on leave. And I said, okay, I'd like to see your leave papers. Because technically, when you're on leave, you're supposed to carry them. I don't know.
You're supposed to. Yeah.
I never did.
Yeah, me either.
But, hold on a second.
Hey, Jerry. I'm out of here.
Okay, I'll lock up.
Okay.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
No, you're good. You're good.
I'm still at the office. So anyways, he couldn't produce his leave papers. And I said, okay, well, just sit tight. And, I call in the dispatch. I call in his vitals and everything. And there was kind of a long delay. And then it seemed like maybe after about 10 minutes or so, the dispatcher comes back and, says he's got an active warrant out of Washington, D.C. And I said, what's the warrant for? And it's for desertion. He's a military deserter. Now,
oh, no way.
Yeah. Now, there's two types of desertion. I mean, under the UCMJ, you can be charged with desertion after only 1 day if you can prove that the person never had any intention to come back. Administratively, you can enter them as a deserter if they've been gone for 30 days or more. I think that was the case with this guy. So, yeah, I got on the radio. My sergeant came out. We placed this guy into custody. And we called, where I worked in Mundelein wasn't far from Great Lakes, the naval where they do boot camp and stuff from the Navy. So we called Great Lakes, and they said, yeah, we'll send some master at arms to come pick him up tomorrow, because we have a little holding cell there. And my sergeant said, yeah, we got to make sure that these guys don't put a beat down on him, because apparently that's happened before. It's like, if they're going to put a beating on him, they're not doing it at the PD, because we're not going to be liable for that. And then, I don't know, I've kind of forgotten about it. And 2 weeks later, I'm at roll call, and my sergeant showed that there was a bounty check for $50 for finding this desertion. Of course, I couldn't keep it, but I didn't know
there was a $50 bounty
for finding a deserter. So
that's funny.
It was kind of funny. It wasn't something I was expecting, but
yeah,
it's
pretty good though.
Well, the FBI during the Vietnam War had a very active deserter program for I think it was a 42 classification, where of course you had the draft back then, and a lot of those guys were, I mean, they were typically young, obviously by definition, they're draftees, and many times they're in good shape, and sometimes the guys would be very compliant, like, hey, I really don't want to be in this war, but they, or sometimes they'd fight or they'd run, and luckily, I mean, we never had anything like that, obviously, since the draft really isn't, what wasn't part of the GWAT, certainly. So, anyways, I thought I'd share a couple of those stories from my patrolman days.
Yeah. Wow. I bet over the years, because how many years total were you both law enforcement and FBI? Like, what was the total?
20? It's about 22 and a half. Yeah, I was a cop for like a year at Post Academy, and then 21 years in the FBI. So, yeah, not as long as other people, but but long enough to accumulate a few stories, I guess. So but and that's the thing about law enforcement. In my job after I retired from the FBI, I worked in the Wisconsin Department of Justice in the Training and Standards Bureau. So I had sort of a law enforcement adjacent position. It was unsworn, but where I was a compliance officer. So our primary role was the oversight of academy training to make sure that the training is compliant with the standards that's established by the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Standards Board. And a lot of it's safety related to make sure they're not, like when they do their scenarios, and if they're using some munitions, they have to have certain protocols in place to ensure that somebody's not introducing a live weapon, because that's happened before. But the reason I bring it up is that the life expectancy for law enforcement officers is significantly low. I don't know the exact time. It used to be like 10 years lower than the general population. And maybe it's changed a little bit. And that's for a variety of reasons, the stress of the job and being exposed to so many critical incidents. Maybe not having the greatest diet, working nights, all these things can play a factor into it. And so this, by the way, one of the reasons they focus on fitness at the National Academy is to try to introduce the concept of officer wellness. And it's not, fitness is certainly a big component of that, but it's not the only part of it. I mean, it's having a good work-life balance, making sure you have friends that aren't cops, getting proper nutrition, eating right, not decompressing by going to the bar all the time and drinking. On occasion, that's fine. But if that's your primary source of stress relief, that's not. And same thing, we see the same thing in our veteran community, of course, as well. So in that, we're trying to move, and that was something that we were focusing on at the academy level. We introduce this wellness component. A lot of it's mental health as well, but to try to move the needle on the life expectancy for law enforcement officers, so that when they do retire, they can maybe enjoy their retirement and not drop dead after 2 years, which unfortunately happens more than it should. And it's hard now to get young people to go into law enforcement. Once again, that's for a variety of reasons, but a lot of it, I think, is the lack of there. At least there's a perception, I think it's accurate, that there's not the support, not from the public so much, but from political leaders, especially in large metropolitan areas like Chicago and Milwaukee and Los Angeles. I mean, there's plenty, that's what I would tell young people. Hey, if you want to become a cop, great, go for it. You might consider, going to work for a sheriff's office, or maybe in a smaller community where you're much more likely to have the support, not only of the public, but of the elected officials.
Right.
So, but I did that for eight years, and I just left that job in February, and that's what brought me here to the University of Arkansas.
So now, talk to me about that. So you're at University of Arkansas, and what exactly is your job? What are you doing there?
Yes, so I'm in an investigator role. It's non-sworn. I work in the Office of Equal Opportunity and Compliance. So our office is responsible for conducting Title IX investigations, which is a federal statute that was passed in 1972, which applies to not just institutions of higher education, but K through 12 as well. And it prohibits discrimination based on sex or gender. Right. It gets kind of a bad rap because of a lot of universities have gotten rid of their wrestling programs, for example, because there's no equivalent. You have a men's wrestling program. If you have a football team, that skews the numbers. But unfortunately, that's the way it's been interpreted, I think, by the Department of Education. It's not in the statute anywhere, that you have to have an equal number of female and male athletes. And we don't really deal with that here anyways. We deal with allegations of, it can, up to and including sexual assault. So sometimes the individual may also be under a criminal investigation. Our process is administrative. It's not criminal. So the due process is a little bit different. I mean, the most severe punishment that can be implemented by the university, if someone is found responsible, they don't use the term guilty or not guilty, they say responsible or not responsible, it can be expelled from the school.
All right.
So the standard of proof is different. Like I said, the rules of evidence is different. The due process is a little bit different. But and then we also do Title VI, which is Civil Rights Acts. That applies to any, not just institutions of higher ed or education. That applies to any employer, and those are typically, allegations of discrimination. A lot of times we'll do our investigation, and typically those are maybe employment issues, and we might refer those back to the department or to human resources to deal with that. Right. And sometimes it turns out the allegations aren't true, or there's not enough evidence to sustain them. So it's nice transition for me because, I don't have, like my job at DOJ, I had a lot of collateral duties with doing different waiver programs. Here it's just do your main job, your investigations. It's Monday through Friday. There's no weekends or working nights or anything. And the university is a pretty good place to work. They take good care of their employees here. And it's been, a nice transition for me and my wife. So I've only been working here since the middle of February, so I still got a lot to learn.
Well, your career and everything that you've done was an awesome story. So thanks for coming on and telling it. It's incredible, the places that you've gone, the things that you've done. Most people, they don't do that. They don't have that experience. So,
well, thank you. Yeah, I've been blessed. I really have. I mean, maybe this is God's plan, but to have the assignments that I had, and then the opportunity to, do some of the traveling and certainly pales in comparison to a lot of other people. But, it's funny because I enjoy the opportunity to talk about it. It's not something like my kids really have much interest in,
Right.
So it's good to have this forum to do that. And I think you're providing a great service, AJ, for doing this. And I'm looking forward to First Sergeant Crouch. By the way, when we talked on the last interview, the U.S. Navy understands the value of Marine Corps drill instructors, and they have for quite some time.
Yeah.
They started using Marine Corps drill instructors, I think, in 1947 for their aviation officer candidate school. And apparently, I don't know the source for this, but I think it's probable. I read this, and I have no reason not to or any reason to doubt it, but that the Navy has found that, like in flight school, for example, the flight students that came through AOCS, now this is a generalization, of course, but that had Marine Corps drill instructors sort of forging them, generally would perform better as a group than those that came through NROTC or the Naval Academy.
Really?
Now, NROTC they obviously have Marine MOIs, just like NROTC, but it's not the same type of relationship where you have a drill instructor that's really putting the screws to you as a candidate. And I think they've even found that in like with buds, if they've had candidates that maybe went through, they must have expanded the role of the Marine Corps drill instructor to their general, because I think they used to just be part of aviation OCS, and I think the regular OCS was just, they had the Navy chiefs. But anyways, I find that, I'm not surprised by that. I find that interesting, and that's that pressure cooker book is just outstanding. I mean, that sort of, and I suspect those drill instructors, and I think First Sergeant Crouch has talked about this, enjoyed, because they had a lot of latitude. They didn't have like Quantico or Parasign where they had a bunch of Marine officers looking over their
Just
shoulder.
wait till some of the later episodes with him, because he goes into some crazy stuff. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So, well, thank you.
Yeah. Hey, you know, I'm glad that you jumped on here. You reached out to me, which was really cool.
Yeah.
That doesn't always happen, but so yeah, I'm very excited that you did that, and shoot, I'm gonna keep doing this as long as I can. So,
well, I appreciate it. Not, I'll hit up some of my veteran buddies to see, you know, if they might have an interest, because I know some of them have some good stories, but some of them are a little, you know, maybe a little bit reluctant to do that. Yeah. You got to respect that, you know, or they do it on their own timeline. So
I think that, at least what I think, and this, I could be wrong, but people think coming on and telling their story it's going to be stressful and stuff like that. And I hope that everyone perceives this, like on the podcast with me, that it's nice and easy flow, and you know, that's what I hope. Yeah, I don't know if that's always the case, but that's what I hope for.
Well, I certainly I pick up on that just from watching some of your other podcasts, you know. So, because I watched a few before I sent this, you know, the inquiry in there. So, yeah. Well,
very nice.
Thank you again, and keep up the good work.
All right, will do. Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'll end this one the same way that I always do. Okay. But to everybody out there, if you're struggling, you need help, anything like that, don't forget that the VA does have some good resources. You can always dial 988, press option 1. You can always text 838-255, or go to veteranscrisisline.net, click on the chat icon. Any of those options will put you in contact with somebody that can help you out. But remember, one veteran life loss is one too many. I care about you. Jerry cares about you. The whole veteran community cares about you. So please reach out for help. And if you're out there, you're not struggling, reach out to the buddies you served with, ask them how they're doing. And if they need that helping hand, please give it to them. All right, Jerry, one last time, thank you very much. To everybody out there, stay motivated, change your socks.
No more 22. On to the journey and finish the fight.